Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. Donald Trump is building his cabinet and inner circle of top advisors. There are nominees like Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, Mike Waltz, and Mike Huckabee. For Israel, it seems that this is something like a dream team. These are not the kind of people who will issue statements of concerns over Israeli actions. Instead, they're likely to be cheering from the sidelines, giving this country, Israel, greater flexibility on the ground in the war, whether in Gaza or in Lebanon. They will support not just giving Israel the weapons it needs to defend itself, but even some of these people support the continued Israeli presence in Judea and Samaria, what's also called the West Bank. Under this new administration, it seems that Israel will face almost zero criticism over settlement expansion and might even get the military support it needs for attacks against Iranian nuclear targets. But does this mean that Israel will have complete freedom of action? I'm not sure. While the atmosphere in Washington may be more accommodating, Israel will still need to tread carefully. What the administration will give Israel is probably not a carte blanche, and it doesn't mean that Israel can do whatever it pleases. It will have more flexibility, but it won't be able to do whatever it wants. And that's what I'm going to try to discuss today with my two JPPI colleagues, Shmuel Rosner and Gil Troy. Both are experts on U.S. politics, and more importantly, they're experts on the Jerusalem-Washington dynamic. And we'll try to figure out together where things are heading for Bibi and Trump, and what does it all mean for the war here in Israel as it soon enters its 15th month. Here we go. So, Gil, let me start with you. You're actually in the US as we speak. I'm curious, when you look at the appointments that Donald Trump has been making, and I mentioned just now some of them, what insight does it give you, if at all, of where he might be going in terms of his policy vis-a-vis Israel and maybe in the wider region of the Middle East?
Let's take a step back from Israel for a second and talk about the fact that his first wave of appointments did seem to be much more normative and much more conventional than people expected, most especially Marco Rubio. And then came the Matt Gaetz and RFK Jr. appointments, which have really thrown the conversation in the United States for a loop. And the intensity of the conversation in the United States right now is much more about that and about those two appointments, especially they seem to be way out of the conventional consensus about things like vaccinations and how to behave properly vis-a-vis young ladies and on and on. And so that's the real focus in the U.S. In terms of Israel, I think it's an interesting moment for American Jewry to say, wait a minute. We may truly 80%, 70%. There's a big debate about what actually the outcomes were on election day for American Jews, but a significant portion of the American Jewish community detests Donald Trump. And yet these appointments are extraordinarily pro-Israel by any way you define pro-Israel. And I think we have to see within the American Jewish community the degree to which a kind of democratic disdain and distancing has been built into the conversation about Israel and about the war. In terms of Israel, I think the challenges remain, which is making sure we win this battle. We have to win the battle against Hamas. We have to win the battle against Hezbollah. We have to win the battle against Iran and its proxies. And to the extent that the United States of America is ready to allow us to do that and work with us, it's a great moment. It's a great moment of potential gain in U.S.-Israel relations.
Shmuel, there is, though, an interesting balancing act, though, that Israel will have to do here, because on the one hand, you kind of feel like, Donald Trump says, we don't start wars, no wars in my administration. Those are, that's what happens under the prior or the outgoing administration. On the other hand, putting some hawks into different positions. Where does Israel fall into all of this? Like, obviously, great support from whether it's Waltz or Rubio or Huckabee, or Hegseth for that matter, any of these different people. But where does it really put Israel in terms of not just the pecking order of importance, but also in whether America is going to want to support some action that Israel is going to want to do somewhere?
Well, I'm going to copy Gil's comments and begin by taking a step back and saying two things of more general nature. The first of which is that the people that were appointed to these positions were appointed first and foremost because of their loyalty to Donald Trump, not because of their positions on Israel. The Secretary of Defense, if indeed nominated and accepted by the Senate, and I'm not sure that all appointments are going to pass the examination of the Senate, but he was appointed to his position not because of his position on Israel. Same is true for Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. These are people who are loyal to the president, which means that whatever they might think about Israel, and I agree that all of them are quite positive on Israel in the sense that their heart is in the right place, they will still have to abide by the president's requests. They are there to do what Donald Trump tells them to do. And I don't think we should be mistaken to think that when they face a dilemma of either doing what the president says or sticking with their guns to what they might think is better for Israel, I think most of them, if not all of them, will choose the president over their personal views. The second comment is that all administrations, and this is something that we tend to forget, but it is always true, the president can make plans and he can appoint people to different positions, but ultimately reality on the ground dictates his actions. The president does not operate in a vacuum. He cannot just come up with a plan and say, I want this, I want that, and while ignoring all the surrounding circumstances. Trump of 2016 is not Trump of 2024. Israel of 2016 is not Israel of 2024. The Middle East changed dramatically in the last couple of years, and especially in the last year. All this will have to be taken into account as we move forward. And look, you pointed out that there are some contradictions that we see even at the outset of the beginning of the term of a new administration. We can already detect that there are some contradictions. On the one hand, Trump does not want to tie Israel's hands, and he wants Israel to win the war. On the other hand, he does not want to have wars under his watch. He sees Iran as a great threat to Israel and to the United States, but he doesn't want American troops on the ground. So all these things will have to be taken into account, and ultimately some policies would emerge, not all of which will be the exact policies that Israel is going to recommend or want.
Gil, I mean, you're something of a presidential historian, so I'm curious, when you kind of look back at the historical context of all of this, one of the questions that I'm kind of just been wondering about in my head is, we always tend to look at second terms of presidents as like, first term, you don't want to do anything too crazy because you want to get reelected. Second term, you're in office, and really it's you no longer owe the same kind of commitment to your constituency or to your base of voters or to your donors because, hey, you're not running for office once again. And it's, how important is that presidential library that you're going to have to raise money for? But with Trump now coming back with a different term in between, and very much, obviously this being his last term in office, although he does like to joke about the fact that maybe it won't be, although that would require some heavy lifting in amending the Constitution, but you never know. What does his legacy look like? In other words, and maybe I'll just sharpen the question. When I look back at his first term in office, right? Very polarizing, very divisive. But one of his big successes was the Abraham Accords. I mean, across the board, right? There weren't any massive domestic successes. There wasn't any other big foreign policy achievement, maybe crossing into North Korea, if you want to call that, but that wasn't anything huge. So he's obviously invested here because there is the legacy angle, but his voters, they don't care about this place. I mean, they don't care. They don't care about the future stability. They want him to fight immigration, and they want the economy back up. And, they got the domestic issue. So where is he in your mind putting the focus for his own legacy? Because he's got to be thinking about that.
For sure. Let's frame it historically and then get to the essence of your question. So first of all, there's a second term curse. Nixon's second term blew up over Watergate. Bill Clinton's second term blew up over the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Even Barack Obama's second term ended up electing Donald Trump. And often from the moment you're elected, you're losing credibility because you're more and more closer to becoming a lame duck. So I think he's aware of that. That's number one. Number two is that it's what Donald Rumsfeld called the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. George W. Bush came in promising to be a domestic policy president, and boom, literally the World Trade Center and the world blew up, and he had to become much more of a foreign policy president. And day to day, you come in unsure what's going to happen. Third dimension is what Dwight Eisenhower said to John Kennedy when they were in their transition. And Eisenhower said, all the tough decisions end up here. All the easy decisions end up out there. So Trump has enough experience in the White House to know all those things are kind of hanging over him. First, let's start off by the fact that there is something called the Trump effect. In the same way that Ronald Reagan, when he was elected in 1980, kind of scared the Ayatollahs, and lo and behold, the hostages, the 52 hostages being held by the American hostages being held by the Iranians back then were freed. We saw a change in tone from Iran almost immediately. On the Israeli street, people stopped worrying so much about an Iranian attack. The rial, the Iranian currency, crashed. The language from the mullahs seemed to just change just enough because they're afraid, as 48% of Americans are, that he's a madman. But a madman sometimes in power against crazy people who are evil can be a good thing. So all these things are kind of playing out. You're absolutely right that it is an America first agenda. And America first means I don't really care that much about China or Russia or Iran. On the other hand, we know that a foreign policy success, like let's say the United States can put tremendous pressure on Iran and we really see a change, that can sometimes boost you domestically. So I think Trump wants to figure out how to use the foreign dynamics to boost himself domestically. But he knows that if 4 years from now, inflation hasn't been tamed, the immigration problem hasn't been solved, and more than that, the tone in the country, the mood in the country is as sour as it's been for the last couple of years, he will go down in flames as a failure. And let's point out, all the Trump people are emphasizing his tremendous victory and how he, ran the House, the Senate, and the presidency. The latest figures, and as California sends in more and more votes, it looks like he didn't even get 50% of the electorate. He got he won the popular vote, he won the electoral vote, but it's a deeply divided country. And if there's one person who doesn't have the skill set to unite the country, it's Donald Trump.
I mean, but it's also interesting on the other hand, just kind of on that point, as I think about it, is the fact that over the next 2 years until the midterms in 26, he will have control of the House and the Senate, or the party will have control of the House and the Senate. It really does give him, because foreign policy is usually the purview, right, of the president. He doesn't really need the Senate or the House to get that kind of stuff done in those big decisions. But on a legislative agenda or slate or whatever he wants to do domestically, he really has a huge opportunity. So it would lead me to kind of think that maybe that focus definitely over the next 2 years is going to be very much on that legislative agenda to an extent.
But we should also point out that there are deep fissures within the Republican Party. And what often happens is when you're an outside party, when you're in the minority, you're really focused and united in opposition. Look at how poorly run the House Republican caucus has been over the last 2 years. They're like the gang that couldn't govern straight. Right. So there's a lot of worry in the United States, especially I'm in New York, among Democrats, that he's going to change the fundamentals of the United States. And one of the things I keep on pointing out is there's separation of power, there's fragmentation of power, there are fissures within the Republican Party, there are all these built-in ballasts into the system. And let's also point out that while Donald Trump has certain abilities in terms of understanding where the American conversation is at, he doesn't like to do homework, and he doesn't like to sit down and roll up his sleeves and get things done in a very systematic way. And that's what you need to really make the kind of legislative changes that people are afraid of.
So Shmuel, with all that in mind, like if you sat with Netanyahu today and he said to you, Shmuel, what should I do? How should I navigate this new incoming Trump administration. Because like part of me thinks, and maybe I'm totally wrong, that if Kamala Harris had won, it actually might have even been a little simpler. Like, you know, kind of the boundaries, you know where you can pull, you know what the levers are, where the pressure points, and you know that at the end you could be really, really bad to them or mean to them or ignore them or whatever it is. And still, they're not going to break, as we say in Hebrew, lishbor takilim. They're not going to break the kitchen dishes, right? Trump, on the other hand, I don't know that you know necessarily what those boundaries are, right? How do you see that?
Well, I think the big question for Israel is a question, the question of the fairy tale. Okay, you walk down the street and you meet a fairy tale, and she or he, they ask you what is it that you want. And so, you know, if this is the dream team that we were hoping for, okay, the dream team of Americans that are going to give you, you know, just ask for it and it's yours. What is it that you want? I think for Israel, it is sometimes easier to just go, you know, work through the motions on a day-to-day basis rather than think about the grand vision for Israel. Because suddenly, okay, let's say we can now just ask for what we want in Gaza. Do we have a clue? Do we have a vision for Gaza that with which we can come to the American team and say, okay, here's our plan for Gaza. Just sign here and here and let us execute it. I'm not sure that we have such plan. Maybe it's easier for us to say, well, we cannot plan ahead because of the Americans. They tie our hands. So we have to work with so many limitations. You know, you can see domestically when the government keeps complaining about the attorney general, as if all the failures of the government are the fault of the attorney general. Let's say that suddenly you remove the attorney general and they have no one to complain about, and suddenly it's them.
No more boogeyman.
Right. Exactly. No boogeyman, no straw man. Just do whatever you want. Do you know what you want? I'm not sure that Israel has clear vision for an exit strategy. I think we do have an exit strategy for Lebanon, and I think we are moving forward with it. It's not clear to me that all parts of the coalition will be pleased with the exit strategy, and I'm sure that the government is going to be hammered by the opposition because the exit strategy is basically, let's just go back to 1701 with some assurances, and that's it. That's the exit strategy.
The UN Security Council 1701 that saw the UNIFIL, the UN force in Lebanon, right?
Exactly. It will not be total victory. It will not be elimination of Hezbollah. It will just be, you know, this mediocre diplomatic settlement that hopefully will hold for the next 5, 10, maybe 20 years. Who knows? 20 years, right. That's a long time. But when we go to the actual dramatic questions of Gaza, settlements, West Bank, annexation, all these things, you know, suddenly we are in this position of having to decide rather than blame someone else because of which we cannot do what we want. Yeah. So it's a difficult situation.
It's interesting because, you know, I was thinking about this over the last few days. There's a former IDF general, Giora Island, who used to be the head of IDF planning, then was actually the head of the National Security Council under Ariel Sharon back in the time of the disengagement from Gaza, about almost now 20 years ago. And he's been saying for a while that it's Biden who's to blame for the fact that the hostages haven't come home. And he actually has the blood of the hostages on his hands because he forced Israel to allow any humanitarian aid into Gaza. And that's why the hostages aren't being released. And I hear that all the time from different people, you know, in some variation or the other. And what I say to them is Biden might have pushed Israel and said, listen, you got to let in humanitarian aid or else I won't be able to give you A, B, C, D and supplies, or there will be this repercussion, this consequence. But at the end of the day, guys, the decision was made by Israel, not by Biden. But the reason I think the government also has an interest, definitely under Biden, to push the narrative of the boogeyman, which is kind of like what you're saying now about the attorney general, is because it deflects the need to take a decision and take responsibility. With Trump, I don't know that you'd be able to do that. And that leads me to the other thing. When we talk about annexation, which now Bezalel Smotrich is floating, and of course Itamar Ben-Gvir would like, and Netanyahu even ran on an election campaign back in 2018. Let's remind everyone on annexing the Jordan Valley, which, wow, we're, 6 years later, and I haven't seen the annexation yet of anything of the Jordan Valley. But at the end of the day, annexation, it's not about Donald Trump telling us we can annex. It's about us deciding, do we want to even annex? And I would argue that Bibi doesn't want to annex. Now, I could be all wrong, but it's like a ridiculous situation, as if everyone thinks now Donald Trump will solve Israel's problems.
As a fact, I can say that he certainly didn't want to annex 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe he changed his mind. But Bibi of the mid previous decade was fiercely against annexation. He did not want all Palestinian towns in the West Bank under Israeli jurisdiction. If he changed his mind, he'll have to explain why. I suspect he did not change his mind, but the coalition is...
The politics might require of him to...
The politics might require it, and he will not have Joe Biden to blame for not doing it.
Exactly. It's and this is the other thing I try to remind people often, is that since 2000, when Bibi came back in 2009 till 13, he had Ehud Barak in the government, no annexation. In 13 to 15, he had Tzipi Livni in the government and Yair Lapid, no annexation. But from 2015, folks, he's had right-wing governments that would have supported annexation. And Menachem Begin passed the Golan Heights bill in one day in the Knesset. If Netanyahu wants, what day is it? Today is Monday. Today's voting is almost over. Wednesday, he could bring a bill to the Knesset plenum and he could pass it. But I mean, obviously, it's going to be a little more complicated than that. Gil, you are in America, and you're saying you're in New York, so you're meeting with a lot of Jews, I'm guessing, who are suffering from a great deal of anxiety. What is the, besides for some prescripted drugs that some of them might be taking, and I say that jokingly, but also I did have family members who in 2016 needed to take medication after Donald Trump won that election. I haven't checked in to see what they're taking now. What is the sense? What's the pulse that you're getting?
It's quite interesting. In 2016, people were shocked because people just never anticipated that Donald Trump would win. This time, there's kind of a growing fear. And there's a catastrophizing about Trump's return that doesn't, to me as a historian, fit in with the long, proud, complicated, fragmented history of American politics. And I keep on pointing out that the ship of state is a large aircraft carrier. It's not a speedboat. And American policy doesn't shift on a dime like you could potentially do in Israel. In Israel, you have far less separation of powers. You have far fewer brakes on the system. You have 50 governors. You have, as I pointed out, a chaotic Republican caucus. You have different elements of the bureaucracy that are resistant. And it's really interesting is when I simply say to friends of mine, take a chill pill. Let's not go medical. Let's go metaphoric. Because of A, B, C. Because of the fact that you already survived 4 years of Trump, and Trump, January 6th was horrific, but he did leave the White House, and they don't want to hear it. They immediately assume I'm therefore supporting Donald Trump because I'm an Israeli. And so, first of all, they're still litigating the election. Second of all, I think it's a very important warning that Israel has to understand that right now, American-Jewish relations with Israel could get very, very touchy. I think it's very, very important that we figure out from Israel how to say thank you to Joe Biden without offending Donald Trump, but also remembering the sensibilities of 70 to 80% of the American Jewish community. And let's, everybody focuses on the 12% that's anti-Israel. I'm talking about the core of the American Jewish community, which is still traumatized by October 7th, which sends thousands and tens of thousands and millions of dollars to Israel, which is very, very concerned with Israel, but has also bought into more of the democratic analysis of the hostages and of the way to fight the war. So we have to be wary of a certain triumphalism on the part both of Israel and the small core of very loud, extremely ecstatic pro-Trump Jews. And we need some leadership. We need to figure out, and when I'm talking about leadership, I'm not just talking about from the government. I think when we have these conversations with family members, when we speak in synagogues, when we write, we have to be aware of the fact that the United States of America is deeply divided. The American Jewish community, while it's not balanced, is deeply divided. There's a yawning chasm between those people who are just going insane over RFK Jr. and Matt Gaetz, who are very problematic appointments, and those who are absolutely delirious that Mike Huckabee, who's in favor of annexation, is going to be the ambassador to Israel. And so I think this is a point where we're just a little bit of listening, a little bit of sensitivity on both sides. I think also our Democratic friends who are in such despair have to take a breath. And first of all, I say just focus on one positive thing. As I was talking about earlier, the chilling effect on Iran. You have to see that it's not all or nothing. It's not healthy in a democracy to look at leaders as pure good or pure evil, because they're human beings and they're a mix. Donald Trump is a mix. Kamala Harris was a mix. And the all or nothingness of an election campaign has to lead to a more mature conversation during governance period. But of course, that's not a prediction, and it's barely a hope because it's not likely to happen.
Shmuel, you mentioned before the Attorney General about, kind of being the boogeyman and maybe the possibility of Netanyahu firing him, and that's firing her, sorry. And that's now again, Gali Bahar of Miara, that's again back on the table. And there's reports also that Netanyahu might want to fire the head of the Shabak, the Shin Bet, Ronain Bar, and he's got the investigation of the leaks from his office. I mean, and the testimony that what he asked for it to be delayed, it was not delayed. Personally, I think the judges made a mistake, but I put that aside for a moment. Netanyahu is on the one hand consolidating power, firing Gallant, putting Israel Katz in his place, Gideon Sa'ar, now foreign minister, coalition stable, IDF draft law. Seems like he's weathered that storm, but still, the guy's never out of the woods. Like every step that he does that seems to make things better, there's another 10 different mines or minefields along the way.
And he also doesn't improve his standings with the public. That's another obstacle for him. It is true that Netanyahu was able to consolidate power within the parliament, within the Knesset. He now has an even larger majority coalition, so he can pass all kinds of legislation with a clear majority and a definitive majority. But with the public, his situation did not improve at all. We see it in public polls, including the polls that we conduct at JPPI. His approval rating is still just slightly above 30% since the beginning of the war and up until now, which means that he does have certain limitations. There are certain things that you cannot do with such low approval rating, even if you do have the hands or the fingers in the Knesset. Because that passing certain things or trying certain things might create a steer that you will not be able to control. So on the one hand, it's true, Netanyahu is quite powerful. He can still lead Israel. He can still lead the war. He can toy with all kinds of ideas about firing this person or that person, which he might ultimately do, but there is still some type of supervision over his ability to extend the power of the coalition by public resistance, by the fact that the public is not with him. The public does not trust him, does not trust the government. So the government is in some ways contained by public opinion or limited by public opinion. Then again, it's not a good situation for Israel. It's better to have a majority government that has a majority of the public supporting it. We are not in this situation. We are not likely to be in this situation, in such situation, until after the next election. Because right now, clearly what the coalition does is to prolong its term for as long as possible, because all politicians in the coalition understand that there will be a reshuffle if elections are to take place.
And that's what I always remind people, just even today, having lunch with a European diplomat, is that the ultra-Orthodox parties, they don't like, they would like to see the draft law pass. They would like the exemption. They would like the daycare bill to pass. But they also understand that in a government that does not include them, it's not exactly that things would be better off. So there is that gamble that's also involved there. And I think that applies to everyone in this coalition, including Itamar Ben-Gvir, who could also be someone who could potentially try to bring down the government, although his numbers are a bit different than what they were now that Gideon Sa'ar is solidly in the foreign ministry and enjoying already. I think just in the last 2 weeks, he's been out of the country a bunch of times. He's enjoying the travel that comes with the ministry. But Gil and Shmuel, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to our viewers and our listeners. Another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. You can find us, as always, on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and, of course, the Times of Israel website. We'll see you back here on Thursday. In the meantime, have a great week. Thank you.